memorize it. So what you see on the screen that is in the parentheses, that's inside the bars, that's how I've sort of kind of summed it up, okay? So we can sort of get through this. So beginning with verse 1. It came about that 4 kings and their armies made war with 5 kings and their armies, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. All these kings and their armies came to the valley of Siddim, and they lined up for battle. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then, verse 11, the 4 kings and their armies took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. Verse 12. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. Then a survivor came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was residing by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner. And these were allies with Abram, verse 14. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit. Verse 15. Then he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them. He brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the other people. Now I want you to think of the godliest person you know. How would your life be different if you were forced to live without that person, or if you chose to live without that person? Abram occupies center stage through nearly 14 chapters of Genesis. We often refer to him as the father of our faith. In chapter 2 of James, Abram is called by James a friend of God. Tonight, however, we are going to consider, for the most part, Abram's nephew Lot. And we are going to see that Lot lived in the shadow of genuine spiritual strength, and yet failed to take advantage of it. Lot lived with a man who knew how to walk by faith. Lot lived with a man who could see clearly with spiritual eyes. But he himself trusted his physical eyes only. Do you remember that from chapter 13? Well, let's look at it again, beginning with verse 10. Lot raised his eyes and saw all the vicinity of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. Verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the vicinity of the Jordan and settled in the cities of the valley. Lot embraced the very ones who would lead him eventually to compromise. Genesis chapter 13, verse 12 says, Lot settled in the cities of the vicinity of the Jordan and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked. By the middle of chapter 14, tragedy strikes Lot and his family when the cities of both Sodom and Gomorrah came under attack. Verse 10 tells us that the political systems of those two cities failed its citizens, as did the social systems. The leaders of Sodom and Gomorrah fled when they should have had well-prepared defenders on the front lines protecting the people. But not only that, the only recourse for those who escaped the slaughter was to head for the hills, literally, leaving their homes, leaving their businesses open to being ransacked by the invaders. Then verse 12 tells us specifically that Lot and his family lost all their possessions and had been taken captive. Now, do you suppose Lot, at this moment in his life, is rethinking his decision to move his family to the vicinity of Sodom? There is no doubt that this tragedy came upon Lot as a warning, as tragedy often does. But did Lot learn anything? One would hope so. But we are going to see, as we continue through the book of Genesis, that it doesn't appear that Lot became any wiser as either a father or a decision maker. Now, I want to take a few moments to demonstrate Lot's progression of compromise. First, Genesis 13:12 tells us that Lot moved into the shadow of Sodom. Not quite in Sodom, but on the outskirts of Sodom, he pitched his tent toward Sodom. Second, one chapter later, verse 12, we learn that Lot, by this time, had actually begun to live in Sodom. First on the outskirts, now living in Sodom itself. Third, if we forward to the first verse in Genesis 19, we see that Lot had come to occupy a place of honor at the city gate of Sodom. Now, most of you know that the gate of a city in the ancient world is where the men of prominence took their seats. It was at the gate of the city that justice was administered. It was at the gate of the city that important decisions were discussed and made regarding issues of the municipality. Now, we are not told how Lot became one of the leading men, but somehow he found a place right in amongst them. I love the word amongst, don't you? That's a great southern word, isn't it? I'm just up there amongst us. You remember, how many of you remember, what was that comedian's name from Mississippi? Who? No, not the cable guy. I can't even think of his name right now. Jerry Clower. Yeah, and he used to tell all kinds of stories, and one time he told a story of when his uncle was trying to get up in a tree and rescue his coon dog from the bobcat that had him tied up in the top of that tree. And that bobcat got a hold of his uncle, and he said, "Whoo! Somebody shoot up in here amongst us. One of us got to have some relief." I can't see the word amongst without thinking about that story. And it is a great story. And so here is Lot. He is right in amongst them. Now, a man of distinction in the very center of the city, listen to this, that had been placed on God's calendar for destruction. In chapter 13, verse 13, God refers to the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah as exceedingly grave. So grave, in fact, that Moses in verse 13 of chapter 19 depicts their sin as crying out. So Lot comes to be known by his association with the city of wickedness. As one translation puts it, a city in which the people were sinning immensely against the Lord. Another translation refers to the men of Sodom as particularly evil in defiance of the Lord. Now, Lot may have been neither immensely sinful nor defiant, but that is who he associated with. Acquaintances only they may have been, but ongoing connection to acquaintances can be detrimental to a person's reputation. And I can say to you that Lot's reputation took a lot of beating and tarnish because of his association with those at the heart of this city. Now I want you to notice Abram's reputation, on the other hand, is stated in verse 13 of Genesis 14. Moses writes, a survivor came and told Abram, look at this, the Hebrew. Now this is the first use of the term Hebrew in the Bible. While the term Israel appears nearly 2,400 times in the Bible, the word Hebrew appears only 34 times in the Bible, with most of those being found in the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Outside the Pentateuch, King Saul used the word Hebrew as a reference to Israel. One of the Philistine commanders called David and his armies Hebrews. And Jonah utilized the term Hebrew as a self-identifying mark that seemed somehow to awaken him to his responsibilities as a prophet of the Lord. Now, amazingly, when non-Hebrews use the term, they meant it as a pejorative. For example, when Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of raping her, she referred to him as that Hebrew whom you, pointing to her husband, brought into this house. And Joseph, though he became the second most powerful man in Egypt, had to eat alone because the Egyptians considered Hebrews to be loathsome. Now, the word Hebrew to the Israelites was something different altogether. It is actually an ethnic term that scholars trace back to Eber. Jump us ahead. I know that's in there somewhere. It is actually an ethnic term that refers or is traced back to Eber. Eber is a man identified in the genealogies of Genesis 10 and 11 as the great-great-great-grandson of Noah, as well as the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham. Now, the word itself means opposite side or from beyond. It contains the idea of being semi-nomadic or being a non-citizen, and even being that of a warrior and or a rebel. Now, perhaps Paul had this in mind when he said of believers in verse 20 of Philippians 2, our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly await for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. We are non-citizens. We are from the other side. We do not belong to this side. And then in Philippians 2, just before identifying the believer as a citizen of heaven, Paul depicted those whose citizenship lies outside the kingdom. Notice what he said. They are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, and whose glory is in their shame, who have their minds on earthly things. Yikes. If you ever say, what is to be the difference between me as a believer and the rest of the people around me who do not believe? Turn in your Bibles to the book of Philippians, chapter 2, and read what Paul has to say, beginning with verse 18 through the end of the chapter. I think Peter likely had the same thought in the first verse of his first letter when he began his salutation like this: to those who reside as strangers, scattered. Some translations use the word aliens. To those who reside as aliens. Again, we are not of this world. We are from the other side. We do not have our roots and our calling here. And so many Christians have difficulty getting that into their heads and their hearts. They act like they belong here. They act like that everything is here. And the truth of the matter is, other than the relationships we hold with those whom we love and love us, we have nothing here. We are like the Hebrews. We're non-residents. We're from over yonder. Look at Colossians 3, chapters 1 and 2. Paul addresses those who have been raised with Christ. Notice what he says. Keep seeking the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on the things that are on the earth. Now, by the time of the monarchy in Israel, and when I say the time of the monarchy, I'm talking about when Israel came together as a nation and had their first king, who was Saul. By the time of the monarchy, when a person referred to himself as a Hebrew, that reference set forth an identity that the person so described was intimately connected to those who were called to be different than everybody else in the world. Well, how then were the Hebrews different? Let me give you two suggestions. One, they were different in that they had been chosen to carry the light of God to the world. Now, there are those religions out there who seek to bring people in even by force as necessary, but that's not who the believers are. As believers, as people from the other side, as a descendant of the Hebrews, you and I have been chosen to carry God's light to the world in which we live. Here's number two. The Hebrews were different in that their identity was meant to shape every decision made and every action taken. Now, I don't know about you, but I need that reminder periodically and from time to time. I think we all do. We are from the other side. All right, we've talked about Lot as an individual, and we've talked about Abram as an individual. Now let's compare these two men. One who is identified by his association with Sodom, and the other identified as a Hebrew. So right out of the gate, let's look at Lot. Lot lived in Sodom. And in Sodom, he was out of fellowship with God. Abram, on the other hand, lived by the oaks of Mamre in fellowship with God. Chapter 13 closes with Abram moving his tents to Hebron and settled in an area belonging to the Amorite named Mamre. And according to the biblical record, Mamre apparently owned an oak grove of extensive size, at least large enough to provide cover for Abram and his entourage of hundreds. Now, the significant thing about Abram's move to Hebron is that he built an altar there. In chapter 14, verse 13, Abram is still in Hebron at the oaks belonging to Mamre, where he regularly worshiped the Lord. It is not recorded that Lot had any connection to any place of worship. Next comparison. Lot and his family were alone and unprotected. Abram, on the other hand, had established allies. In verse 13 in chapter 14, we are told that Abram formed an alliance with Mamre and his two brothers, Eshcol and Aner. I don't know why they couldn't have named them Bob and Joe, but they gave him all these names. But he established an alliance with these people who were close to him. Now, this is no small action. Why? Number one, these men, Abram, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, recognized the reality of the dangers they faced from hostile forces. And two, they prepared a strong defense should those hostile forces come calling. Does this not say something about today's world? Does this not say something about recognizing the dangers of the era in which we live? And does this not say something about creating a defense against those dangers? And this is true not only on a national level, but it is true on a local level. And listen to me, it is true on a personal level. There are forces that want to destroy your family. And if we are wise, we work toward the creation of allies when the hostile forces come. Back to the comparison. For Lot, what at first seemed best, go back one, go back another one, there you go. What first seemed best is worst. For Abram, what at first seemed worst turns out to be the best. Now the next slide. Lot was unprepared for disaster. Abram, on the other hand, is prepared for disaster. Now apparently, according to verse 10, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with their armies, had no strategy for dealing with the tar pits in the valley of Siddim. Consequently, these unprepared troops became bogged down and defeated without the enemy having to fire even a shot. According to verses 11 and 12, these same ill-prepared forces left their food supply as well as their citizens unprotected. They were not prepared for disaster. You know why? They were too busy having a good time. They were too busy partying. They were too busy pleasing themselves. On the other hand, check out Abram's readiness in verse 14. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, look at this, I love this. He led out his trained men, born in his house, numbering 318. Now, this doesn't include the women. This doesn't include the children. This doesn't include those men who may not have been fit to do battle and to defend the encampment. But Abram trained these men, numbering 318, and went in pursuit. Verse 15. Then he divided his force against them by night, and he and his servants defeated them. Next comparison. Lot was a follower. Abram, on the other hand, was a leader. Now, I'm not telling you that leaders are better than followers. If a leader does not have followers, then he is only taking a walk. Followers are absolutely critical, but followers are no good without leaders. Abram was a leader. Lot just followed the trends. And then finally, in this comparison, Lot looked to his own interests, while Abram looked to the interests of others. Check out verse 16. He brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the other people, that is, those outside of his family. In other words, he rescued the citizens that survived the attack. He rescued the citizens of Lot from destruction. Now, this would have been the perfect opportunity for Abram to say about Lot, he got what he deserved. You ever said that about someone? Something negative ever happened to someone and you just kind of went, well, I guess he thinks different now, doesn't he? Perfect time for Abram to say, Lot, you are a fool. Lot, you are suffering from your own action. We don't see any of that anywhere in this passage. Yes, it would have been the perfect time. And yes, that is what many of us choose to do. But instead, what we see in this passage is Abram put on display features essential to a dynamic, effective life. So what are these features? Are you ready for them? Here's the first. It is sympathy over resentment. Do we have time for testimony tonight? Second feature. It is generosity over bitterness. Third feature. It is appreciation over accusation. Here's the fourth feature. And it is the fourth feature that makes the first three features possible. So what is the fourth feature? Here it is. It is belief in God's interjection regarding every circumstance of life as opposed to disbelief. We are going to see this idea again and again as we move through Genesis. It is incredible the life principles that come to us from an ancient world in a time that took place so long ago. Sympathy over resentment. Ever had some resentment? Generosity over business. Appreciation over accusation. Let me ask you something. Has resentment, bitterness, and accusation ever solved an issue for you? Anybody want to stand up and give us a testimony? I mean, I'm serious. If there's ever been a time in your life when resentment and bitterness and accusation ever solved a problem in your life, I want you to come up and give us a testimony right now. And then I'm going to smack you right off the platform. Because Abram believed in the interjection of God regarding every circumstance, and I mean every circumstance. That doesn't mean God is responsible for every circumstance. But whatever circumstance we face, God will interject Himself into that circumstance and do something beyond imagination. If we believe that, it's going to change the dynamic of our life. If we believe that, our relationships with other people are going to be different. And because these things were true in Abram's life, Abram could exhibit passive virtues. Now, when I say passive virtues, what do you think I mean by that? He didn't have to be angry. That is not a passive virtue. He did not have to be resentful. That is not a passive virtue. He did not have to be accusative. That is not a passive virtue. Because Abram could exhibit passive virtues bathed in decision making and initiative, this man could make decisions and he could take the initiative simply because he was not consumed with all the junk. Does that make sense to you? Now let me put this in terms as simple as I can. We take everything that's on that screen right now, everything that I just shared with you, and here's how we say it. Abram stayed out of everyone else's column, and he took care of business in his own column. It was not in his column to decide where Lot would live. It was not in his column how Lot decided to raise his family. It was not his column how Lot made a living. It was not in his column that Lot's poor choices resulted in tragedy in his life. As we're going to see, he lost his wife. He lost his sons-in-law. In addition to all his possessions. Those things weren't under his column. But let me tell you what was in his column. Trusting God, rescuing Lot, and doing the right thing. He didn't have anything to do with Lot's failure. But that wasn't in his column. So he was able to discern confidently and clearly what was in his column. I got to go get this boy. Even so, we are going to discover in chapters to come that Lot didn't learn his lesson. He went right back to Sodom. Do we see Lot saying, boy, are you crazy? No, it's not under his column. Do we see Abram criticizing Lot and bringing him down? No, it wasn't under his column. But I tell you what was under his column: praying for Lot and his family. And because of his prayers, Lot and some of his family was saved. How would it change our lives if we knew what's under our column and what's not? When we get that figured out, there will no longer be resentment, bitterness, and accusation. Those things will fall away from us like rain falls off a glass. And so this week, when someone irritates the living daylights out of you, and I know since I've talked about this, somebody's going to come along and irritate the living daylights out of me. Know what's under your column and what's not. Take care of what's under your column and leave everybody else's column alone.